Alright, so last time on this channel, I made a video examining the similarities between Mr. Satan and Hulk Hogan. And I very specifically teased making another video about all the wrestling spoofs in Dragon Ball. So you can consider this video the sequel. Cause let's face it, baby, these days, you gotta have a sequel.
Cause let's face it, baby, these days, you gotta have a sequel.
Thanks, buddy. Oh, speaking of which, I'll give a shout out to anyone in my next video if you can correctly answer the following. How many references to Scream 1996 were in this video? There's already been 2 so far if you were wondering. So stay tuned, cause this one's a scream, baby. Oh yeah, and don't forget to timestamp them either. Andre the Giant is arguably the most famous wrestler ever, so it's no surprise that he'd end up in this video. He was one of wrestling's biggest attractions all over the world, and he actually competed in Japan in the 70s under the name Monster Husimov. The point is, people knew of Andre all around the world, so it's no surprise he was spoofed in Dragon Ball, chapter 114. In a prelims match for the 22nd tournament, Kuririn squashed him so fast that Toriyama didn't even bother giving him a name. He eventually did get a name, in the anime. In episode 85 of Dragon Ball, Yamcha put this dude over hard, explaining to Goku that this giant was a former pro wrestling world champion named Anton the Great. Anton the Great, Andre the Giant. What a coinkydink. And Yamcha goes on. He mentions that Anton was so strong that he ran out of opponents and had to wrestle underground. And during his fight, he catches Kuririn in his grip, a grip so strong he can apply 400 kilograms of pressure. Kuririn sells this for a bit, until he decides to cut the crap and then proceeds to job this guy out with a judo flip. And this episode, by the way, aired October 28th of 1987, which, in terms of notoriety, might actually be Andre's biggest year. He headlined WrestleMania with Hulk Hogan in front of 78,000 people, even though the WWE likes to claim it was 90,000. Still though, this was 2 of the most famous wrestlers in the world going at it. And this photo of the 2 on the screen has got to be the most famous pro wrestling picture ever taken. Also, the chapter that Toriyama spoofed him in, 114, first premiered March 3rd of 1987, which was just a few weeks before Andre took on Hogan in one of the biggest WrestleMania main events ever, if not the biggest. Speaking of Hogan, he made a cameo in this episode, just a few short minutes before old Anton the Great ripoff showed up. Come to think of it, this arc has a pretty good amount of wrestling references. The whole tournament style setting is pretty similar to King of the Ring and other wrestling tournaments, and in episode 100, Goku even put Tenshin Han in the Boston Crab, aka the Walls of Jericho. And it actually worked in getting Ten to retract 2 of his arms, so nice job. The other Andre spoof takes us to Dragon Ball Movie 3, A Mystical Great Adventure. This movie premiered July 9th of 1988. This also happens to be the same year that Andre became the WWF's world champion.
Yeah, for like 2 seconds.
Anyway, in the film, a tournament is held where the winner will receive anything his heart desires from the Emperor of Mifan, Chaozu. Regardless, Yamcha's first up, and his opponent, who wasn't even given a name, steps into the ring, causing the camera to shake just like Anton. They look the same, the scene's even directed the same, they sound the same. Actually, here's a fun fact. Daisuke Gori, the same man that would go on to voice Mr. Satan, aka Hulk Hogan, who I dedicated my last video to, is also credited for voicing Anton the Great in episode 85. See how it comes full circle? Funny, isn't it? Well, Yamcha made quick work of this dude, and while there are many giants in wrestling, it's pretty easy to tell that these 2 were parodies of mid to late 80s Andre. And that's all I got to say about that. Yaj Obs Mask. This could be a parody of masked wrestlers in general, but there's no denying that this mask is identical to the one worn by Dick the Destroyer. With a name like that, you know his girlfriend loved him. But on a serious note, Dick the Destroyer's popularity took off in the 70s in Japan while Toriyama was still in his youth. This popularity can be traced back to May 24th, 1963. On this night, he wrestled Rikidozan, who's known as the father of pro wrestling in Japan. This match was allegedly viewed by over 70 million people, which would be the largest in Japanese history. Dick the Destroyer would go on to be the first American wrestler signed to a Japanese wrestling company, and would find himself in Japanese talk shows, comedies, and music albums, and more, cementing his status as a gaijin talento, or a foreign talent, a celebrity who's exclusive to Japan. So while he may not have been a big deal in the States like Stone Cold or John Cena, in Japan he was a whole nother story. So there's no way Toriyama would have missed him in his youth. And even during the creation of this arc in 1988, because Dick would retire from wrestling in Japan in 1993. The anime staff got a bit more mileage out of masked Yajirobe. In his first fight in the prelims in episode 135, he took on a dude that looked like the Iron Sheik. Yajirobe beat him cleanly, so the Sheik fake just had to get his heat back post-match. But that wasn't gonna work for Yajirobe, brother, so he decided to eat his butt and make him humble. No, seriously, he took a mouthful of that booty. This was probably just a funny nod to Dick the Destroyer biting Rikidozan's ear after the match. Did you know, in Dragon Ball, there's even freaking pro wrestling in space, bro? I gotta give a huge thank you to Kanzenshu for finding this one. This information's actually from a 3-page feature in the 1991 number 25 issue of Weekly Shonen Jump. The big green dude, no, not that one, I'm talking about Cooler's henchman from DBZ Movie 5, Dure, was like Space Goldberg, a galactic Goldberg, if you will. Apparently, he was born on planet Cooler number 256, formerly known as planet Bepper. Bonus if you can get that name pun. The planet had a continent that was constantly surrounded by magma, which gave him a tough body. So what did he decide to do with that tough body? Of course, go into pro wrestling. He wrestled in the Space Pro Wrestling League, winning 300 straight matches undefeated, killing all of his opponents in the process. And it was because of this bloodthirst that he switched to becoming a planet warrior instead. Now see, this got me curious, because now I'm wondering if he was a heel or a face. Tell me what y'all think in the comments. I personally think heel, because like, you don't just murder hundreds of people and expect anyone to cheer for you after, right? Nah, what am I talking about? Okay, so there was some Mr. Satan trivia that I left out of my previous video, so I'm just gonna include it here. In the 2003 Dragon Power / Ask Akira Toriyama interview, when pro wrestling regarding Mr. Satan is brought up, Toriyama says he's not really a fan. And in the Dragon Ball Forever Q&A, he also claims that he doesn't believe Mr. Satan is as strong as Bob Sapp, who among other things was a former pro wrestler himself. And how could I not mention all the over-the-top and ridiculous names Mr. Satan gives for his finishing moves? It's everywhere in wrestling. But of course, in Dragon Ball, finishing moves aren't just limited to Mr. Satan. It's also funny that his real name is Maku. In English, this can be pronounced as Mark, a term that originated during the carnival days. It applies to fans who aren't aware of the inner workings of the business. They are the marks. And lastly, in the Viz manga, he's introduced as Hercule, the former wrestler who went by the ring name of Mr. Satan. I've seen ideas thrown around of who Karoni could be a parody of. The main one is usually Shawn Michaels, with Miss Pisa being the sensational Sherry to his HBK, but I don't really buy that because they didn't really interact in the way Shawn and Sherry did. But then again, did Shawn even enjoy Sherry's company? What is obvious though is that Piroshki is a parody of Big Van Vader. It's his appearance and his headgear that give him away. For anyone who doesn't know, from 1987 to 1992, Vader was a freaking behemoth in Japan. He would come to the ring in a giant mastodon helmet that would shoot out smoke like a volcano or something, just like what Piroshki is wearing. That helmet could sell out arenas on its own. Vader ran through New Japan, and in 1989, he became the first gaijin, or foreigner, to win the IWGP Championship belt. He would go on to do this 2 more times and even win the tag titles in 1992. So yeah, the anime staff knew exactly what they were doing with this one. Vader had a unique look and wrestling style, and he was actually the WCW champion when Piroshki was introduced in episode 176. This episode aired March 3rd, 1993. And finally, I want to take a look at Dragon Ball Z's 9th movie, The Galaxy at the Brink, The Super Incredible Guy. First, I just want to point out how the Battle Royale type tournament is similar to wrestling Battle Royales, like the Royal Rumble, or whatever the heck this was. Next up, the Galactic Warriors, who are all just Mr. Satan's pupils. Surprise!
Surprise, Sydney.
I'll come back to the first one. As for the second guy, he could potentially be a parody of Mil Mascaras, a huge star in Japan in the 70s. And unlike most of the guys on this list, he wasn't a vicious monster heel, and he was one of the first to showcase Mexican wrestling in Japan. And he eliminated himself from the Royal Rumble. I actually believe this guy could be a parody of masked luchadors in general, but who knows, maybe the anime staff could have remembered Mil Mascaras from back in the day. It's not like wrestling isn't popular in Japan after all. This third guy, clad in football pads with spikes and his tongue out with the face paint, is an obvious spoof of the Road Warriors. That's what it looks like on the surface. But what if I told you it may be something different? He may just be one big parody of the Hellraisers. As the story goes, Road Warrior Hawk left the WWF following 1992 SummerSlam and formed a team with New Japan wrestler Kensuke Sasaki. Sasaki became the Power Warrior, and together they became known as the Hellraisers. As a team, they would raise hell in New Japan, winning the tag titles in December of 92 all the way through to August of 93. Movie 9 is sandwiched in between this title reign. It premiered July 10th, 1993. And unlike the previous connection to Mil Mascaras who wrestled in the 70s, these guys were champions and in their prime during this time. The last warrior is Abdullah the Butcher, and probably Dodoria. Abdullah was a huge attraction in Japan and is most well known for his hardcore wrestling, using his forks to cut his opponents up.
Cut the fuck up, okay?
And while it's not a fork, this warrior uses his own weapon of choice, a flail, to slash at the camera. Honestly, it looks more like Stan Hansen's lariat. What's funny about the Galaxy Warriors is that they seem to all be caricatures or parodies of gaijin, or wrestlers foreign to Japan. But that makes sense. These guys' gimmick is that they're foreigners to Earth. And this is why I believe the first warrior probably fits that criteria. And based on this criteria, I'm going to give my candidates for who I believe he could be. Number 1, Macho Man Randy Savage. The shades, the star on his clothes, the extravagant outfit, plus Macho Man just came off of a title reign as the WWF's champion in 1992. And he wrestled as a headliner and an attraction in Japan during WWF's interpromotional collaboration with Super World Sports in 1991. Prior to this, he wrestled in what was considered the best wrestling event of 1990, the WWF All Japan and New Japan Wrestling Summit, in front of over 53,000 attendees in the Tokyo Dome. That night, Randy Savage lost to Genichiro Tenryu, another big star in Japan. But by 1991, Randy Savage had definitely made his mark in the country. Number 2, The Ultimate Warrior. Muscles, tassels, and face paint. And if you lift his shades, his face paint might actually look like the Ultimate Warrior's. Ultimate Warrior also defended the WWF Championship at the 1990 Wrestling Summit. And this guy looks like his name could actually be Warrior. Number 3, Bret Hart. The dude has nearly identical shades, purple pinkish hair which could be a nod to Bret Hart, and did I mention he had tassels? One thing Bret has over Macho and Warrior is that he was the WWF champion closest to this movie's premiere date. He lost the belt April 4th of 1993 at WrestleMania 9. Bret also wrestled at the Wrestling Summit in the longest match of the night for 20 minutes against Tiger Mask. And he wrestled in Japan in the early 80s, so he's got that on them too. Number 4, the Stinger. It's the tassels, man. Sting was also WCW's world champion right around the same time Bret Hart was the WWF's world champion. Sting was also really popular in Japan in 1989, and just like his former teammate, The Ultimate Warrior, he also wore face paint. Number 5, Ricky Steamboat. His hair resembles this man's, and the scales on his forearms make him look more like a dragon. There are honorable mentions though, like Ric Flair. Other than the extravagant outfit, I really don't see much similarities between the two. And the Rockers. They're a few steps below the other guys on this list in terms of popularity. But he could be an amalgamation of all these wrestlers, if not even more. As for these 4, they're done. Bojack and his crew straight up kill these guys.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
They shoot on them. That wasn't a part of the angle. I'll bring this up just so that no one else does. But this sumo wrestler doesn't really look like Yokozuna. You gotta remember, Yokozuna's gimmick is kind of a parody of Japanese sumo wrestlers. Yokozuna is just the highest rank a wrestler, a rikishi, can obtain in sumo wrestling. But there are a few sumo wrestlers turned pro wrestlers, so I'll put him in a gray area. There's another masked fighter that Kuririn kicks in the face, and another one that Trunks throws onto Kuririn's platform. And there's another Andre the Giant lookalike that Gohan can be seen fighting on a TV screen. And finally, Stan Hansen. This man went to Japan with the reputation for being the one to break Bruno Sammartino's neck. And he used this momentum to become a top heel and one of the most successful foreigners to ever wrestle in Japan. He's the only man to have beaten Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki in championship matches, the respective founders of All Japan and New Japan Pro Wrestling. He's a 4-time Triple Crown champ, and his reign from 1992 was relatively close to this movie's premiere. But in this movie, none of that matters. His caricature Udo lost and probably died in a squash match against Gohan in the semis. And that was it for him. The match itself pretty much sums up wrestling. The old grizzled vet going out of his way to put over young, fresh talent. What a pro. Udo may be a total jabroni, but Stan sure isn't. So much so that Akira Toriyama even caricatured the man years before he was disgraced in this movie, posing for the camera with the Raleigh. It was really fun doing research for these last two videos. I had already known many of the similarities between Dragon Ball and wrestling, but these last two videos helped me connect so many dots. Oh, and last one. This one's for fun. Goldberg versus Nappa. Who wins? Alright, see ya.